Welcome back to Northwest Elite Spirit, the channel you come to train your mind, body, and spirit. I'm Coach Brian. If you have not hit that subscribe button yet, do that now and make sure to ring that notification bell to stay up to date on all of my newest releases. This is Rin No Sho, a book of 5 rings, written by Miyamoto Musashi and translated by Victor Harris. Translator's introduction. Japan during Musashi's lifetime. Miyamoto Musashi was born in 1584 in a Japan struggling to recover from more than 4 centuries of internal strife. The traditional rule of the emperors had been overthrown in the 12th century, and although each successive emperor remained the figurehead of Japan, his powers were very much reduced. Since that time, Japan had seen almost continuous civil war between the provincial lords, warrior monks, and brigands, all fighting each other for land and power. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the lords called daimyo built huge stone castles to protect themselves and their lands, and castle towns outside the walls began to grow up. These wars naturally restricted the growth of trade and impoverished the whole country. In 1573, however, one man, Oda Nobunaga, came to the fore in Japan. He became shogun, or military dictator, and for 9 years succeeded in gaining control of almost the whole of the country. When Nobunaga was assassinated in 1582, a commoner took over the government. Toyotomi Hideyoshi continued the work of unifying Japan, which Nobunaga had begun, ruthlessly putting down any traces of insurrection. He reviewed the old gulf between the warriors of Japan, the samurai, and the commoners by introducing restrictions on the wearing of swords. Hideyoshi's sword hunt, as it was known, meant that only samurai were allowed to wear swords, the short one, which everyone could wear, and the long one, which distinguished the samurai from the rest of the population. Although Hideyoshi did much to settle Japan and increase trade with the outside world, by the time of his death in 1598, internal disturbances still had not been completely eliminated. The real isolation and unification of Japan began with the inauguration of the great Tokugawa rule. In 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu, a former associate of both Hideyoshi and Nobunaga, formally became shogun of Japan after defeating Hideyoshi's son Hideyori at the Battle of Sekigahara. Ieyasu established his government at Edo, present-day Tokyo, where he had a huge castle. His was a stable, peaceful government, beginning a period of Japanese history which was to last until the Imperial Restoration of 1868. For although Ieyasu himself died in 1616, members of his family succeeded each other, and the title shogun became virtually an hereditary one for the Tokugawas. Ieyasu was determined to ensure his and his family's dictatorship. To this end, he paid lip service to the emperor in Kyoto, who remained the titular head of Japan, while curtailing his duties and involvement in the government. The real threat to Ieyasu's position could only come from the lords, and he effectively decreased their opportunities for revolt by devising schemes whereby all lords had to live in Edo for alternate years, and by placing great restrictions on traveling. He allotted land in exchange for oaths of allegiance and gave the provincial castles around Edo to members of his own family. He also employed a network of secret police and assassins. The Tokugawa period marks a great change in the social history of Japan. The bureaucracy of the Tokugawas was all-pervading. Not only were education, law, government, and class controlled, but even the custom and behavior of each class. The traditional class consciousness of Japan hardened into a rigid class structure. There were basically 4 classes of person: samurai, farmers, artisans, and merchants. The samurai were the highest in esteem, if not in wealth, and included the lords, senior government officials, warriors, and minor officials and foot soldiers. Next in the hierarchy came the farmers, not because they were well thought of, but because they provided the essential rice crops. Their lot was a rather unhappy one, as they were forced to give most of their crops to the lords and were not allowed to leave their farms. Then came the artisans and craftsmen, and last of all, the merchants, who, though looked down upon, eventually rose to prominence because of the vast wealth they accumulated. Few people were outside this rigid hierarchy. Musashi belonged to the samurai class. We find the origins of the samurai class in the Kondai, stalwart youth system established in 792 AD, whereby the Japanese army, which had until then consisted mainly of spear-wielding foot soldiers, was revived by stiffening the ranks with permanent training officers recruited from among the young sons of the high families. These officers were mounted, wore armor, and used the bow and sword. In 782, the Emperor Kamu started building Kyoto, and in Kyoto, he built a training hall which exists to this day called Buto Kuden, meaning Hall of the Virtues of War. Within a few years of this revival, the fierce Ainu, the original inhabitants of Japan, who had until then confounded the army's attempt to move them from their wild lodgings, were driven far off to the northern island Hokkaido. When the great provincial armies were gradually disbanded under Hideyoshi and Ieyasu, many out-of-work samurai roamed the country redundant in an area of peace. Musashi was one such samurai, a ronin or wave man. There were still samurai retainers to the Tokugawas and provincial lords, but their numbers were few. The hordes of redundant samurai found themselves living in a society which was completely based on the old chivalry, but at the same time, they were apart from a society in which there was no place for men at arms. They became an inverted class, keeping the old chivalry alive by devotion to martial arts with the fervor only Japanese possesses. This was the time of the flowering in Kendo. Kendo, the way of the sword, had always been synonymous with nobility in Japan. Since the founding of the samurai class in the 8th century, the military arts had become the highest form of study, inspired by the teachings of Zen and the feeling of Shinto. Schools of Kendo born in the early Muromachi period, approximately 1390 to 1600, were continued through the upheavals of the formation of the peaceful Tokugawa shogunate and survive to this day. The education of the sons of the Tokugawa shoguns was by means of schooling in the Chinese classics and fencing exercises. Where a Westerner might say, the pen is mightier than the sword, the Japanese would say, banbu ichi, or pen and sword in accord. Today, prominent businessmen and political figures in Japan still practice the old traditions of Kendo schools, preserving the forms of several hundred years ago. To sum up, Musashi was a ronin at a time when the samurai were formerly considered to be the elite, but actually had no means of livelihood unless they owned lands and castles. Many ronin put up their swords and became artisans, but others, like Musashi, pursued the idea of the warrior, searching for enlightenment through the perilous paths of Kendo. Duels of revenge and tests of skill were commonplace, and fencing schools multiplied. Two schools especially, the Ito school and the Yagyu school, were sponsored by the Tokugawas. The Ito school provided an unbroken line of Kendo teachers, and the Yagyu school eventually became the secret police of the Tokugawa bureaucracy. Kendo. Traditionally, the fencing halls of Japan, called dojos, were associated with shrines and temples. But during Musashi's lifetime, numerous schools sprang up in the new castle towns. Each daimyo or lord sponsored a kendo school where his retainers could be trained and his sons educated. The hope of every ronin was that he would defeat the student and master of a dojo in combat, thus increasing his fame and bringing his name to the ears of one who might employ him. The samurai wore two swords thrust through the belt with a cutting edge uppermost. The longer sword was carried out of doors only. The shorter sword was worn at all times. For training, wooden swords and bamboo swords were often used. Dueling and other tests of arms were common, with both real and practice swords. These took place in fencing halls and before shrines, in the streets, and within castle walls. Duels were fought to the death or until one of the contestants was disabled. But a few generations after Musashi's time, in the shinai, a pliable bamboo sword and later padded fencing armor came to be widely used, so the chances of injury were greatly reduced. The samurai studied with all kinds of weapons: halberds, sticks, swords, chain and sickle, and others. Many schools using such weapons to survive in traditional form in Japan today. To train kendo, one must subjugate the self, bear the pain of grueling practice, and cultivate a level of mind in the face of peril. But the way of the sword means not only fencing training, but also living by the code of honor of the samurai elite. Warfare was the spirit of the samurai's everyday life, and he could face death as if it were a domestic routine. The meaning of life and death by the sword was mirrored in the everyday conduct of the feudal Japanese, and he who realized the resolute acceptance of death at any moment in his everyday life was a master of the sword. It is in order to attain such an understanding that later men have followed the ancient traditions of the sword fencing styles, and even today give up their lives for kendo practice. Kendo and Zen. The way of the sword is the moral teaching of the samurai, fostered by the Confucianist philosophy which shaped the Tokugawa system, together with the native Shinto religion of Japan. The warrior courts of Japan, from the Kamakura period to the Muromachi period, encouraged the austere Zen study among the samurai, and Zen went hand in hand with the arts of war. In Zen, there are no elaborations. It aims directly at the true nature of things. There are no ceremonies, no teachings. The prize of Zen is essentially personal. Enlightenment in Zen does not mean a change in behavior, but realization of the nature of ordinary life. The end point is the beginning, and the great virtue is simplicity. The secret teaching of the Ito Ryu school of Kendo, Kiryotoshi, is the first technique of some 100 or so. The teaching is ai-uchi, meaning to cut the opponent just as he cuts you. This is the ultimate timing. It is lack of anger. It means to treat your enemy as an honored guest. It also means to abandon your life or throw away fear. The first technique is the last. The beginner and the master behave in the same way. Knowledge is a full circle. The first of Musashi's chapter headings is ground for the basis of Kendo and Zen, and the last book is void for that understanding which can only be expressed as nothingness. The teachings of Kendo are like the fierce verbal forays to which the Zen student is subjected. Assailed with doubts and misery, his mind and spirit in a whirl, the student is gradually guided to realization and understanding by his teacher. The Kendo student practices furiously, thousands of cuts, morning and night, learning fierce techniques of horrible war until eventually sword becomes no sword, intention becomes no intention, a spontaneous knowledge of every situation. The first elementary teaching becomes the highest knowledge, and the master still continues to practice this simple training his every prayer. Concerning the life of Miyamoto Musashi, Shinmin Musashi no Kami Fujiwara no Genshin, or as he is commonly known, Miyamoto Musashi, was born in the village called Miyamoto in the province of Mimasaka in 1584. Musashi is the name of an area southwest of Tokyo, and the appellation no Kami means noble person of the area, while Fujiwara is the name of the noble family foremost in Japan over 1,000 years ago. Musashi's ancestors were a branch of the powerful Harima clan in Kyushu, the southern island of Japan. Hirata Shokan, his grandfather, was a retainer of Shinmin Iga no Kami Sudashige, the lord of Takayama Castle. Hirata Shokan was highly thought of by his lord and eventually married his lord's daughter. When Musashi was 7, his father Munisai either died or abandoned the child, as his mother had died. Bennosuke, as Musashi was known during his childhood, was left in the care of an uncle on his mother's side, a priest. So we find Musashi an orphan during Hideyoshi's campaigns of unification, son of a samurai in a violent, unhappy land. He was a boisterous youth, strong-willed and physically large for his age. Whether he was urged to pursue kendo by his uncle or whether his aggressive nature led him to it, we do not know, but it is recorded that he slew a man in single combat when he was just 13. The opponent was Arima Kihei, a samurai of the Shinto Ryu school of military arts, skilled with sword and spear. The boy threw the man to the ground and beat him about the head with a stick when he tried to rise. Kihei died vomiting blood. Musashi's next contest was when he was 16, when he defeated Tadashima Akiyama. About this time, he left home to embark on the warrior pilgrimage, which saw him victor in scores of contests and which took him to war 6 times until he finally settled down at the age of 50, having reached the end of his search for reason. There must have been many ronin traveling the country on similar expeditions, some alone like Musashi and some enjoying sponsorship, though not on the scale of the pilgrimage of the famous swordsman Tsukahara Bokuden, who had traveled with a retinue of over 100 men in the previous century. This part of Musashi's life was spent living apart from society, while he devoted himself with a ferocious single-mindedness to search for enlightenment by the way of the sword. Concerned only with perfecting his skills, he lived as men need not live, wandering over Japan, soaked by the cold winds of winter, not dressing his hair, not taking a wife, nor following any profession save his study. It is said he never entered a bathtub lest he was caught unawares without a weapon, and that his appearance was uncouth and wretched. In the battle which resulted in Ieyasu succeeding Hideyoshi as shogun of Japan, Sekigahara Musashi joined the ranks of the Ashikaga army to fight against Ieyasu. He survived the terrible 3 days during which 70,000 people died, and also survived the hunting down and massacre of the vanquished army. He went up to Kyoto, the capital, when he was 21. This was the scene of his vendetta against the Yoshioka family. The Yoshiokas had been fencing instructors to the Ashikaga house for generations. Later forbidden to teach kendo by Lord Tokugawa, the family became dyers and are dyers today. Munisai, Musashi's father, had been invited to Kyoto some years before by the shogun Ashikaga Yoshiaka. Munisai was a competent swordsman and an expert with the jit, a kind of iron truncheon with a tongue for catching blades. The story has it that Munisai fought 3 of the Yoshiokas, winning 2 of the duels, and perhaps this has some bearing on Musashi's behavior towards the family. Yoshioka Saijiro, the head of the family, was the first to fight Musashi on the moor outside the city. Saijiro was armed with a real sword, and Musashi with a wooden sword. Musashi laid Saijiro out with a fierce attack and beat him savagely as he lay on the ground. The retainers carried their lord home on a rain shutter, where for shame he cut off his samurai topknot. Musashi lingered on in the capital, and his continued presence further irked the Yoshiokas. The second brother, Denshichiro, applied to Musashi for a duel. As a military ploy, Musashi arrived late on the appointed day, and seconds after the start of the fight, he broke his opponent's skull with one blow of his wooden sword. Denshichiro was dead. The home issued yet another challenge with Hanshichiro, the young son of Seijiro, as champion. Hanshichiro was a mere boy, not yet in his teens. The contest was to be held by a pine tree adjacent to rice fields. Musashi arrived at the meeting place well before the appointed time and waited in hiding for his enemy to come. The child arrived dressed formally in war gear with a party of well-armed retainers determined to do away with Musashi. Musashi waited concealed in the shadows, and just as they were thinking that he had thought better of it and had decided to leave Kyoto, he suddenly appeared in the midst of them and cut the boy down. Then drawing both swords, he cut a path through them and made his escape. After that frightful episode, Musashi wandered over Japan, becoming a legend in his own time. We find mention of his name and stories of his prowess in registers, diaries, and monuments, and in folk memory from Tokyo to Kyushu. He had more than 60 contests before he was 29 and won them all. The earliest account of his contests appears in Nitten Ki, or Two Heavens Chronicle, a record compiled by his pupils a generation after his death. In the year of the Yoshioka affair, 1605, he visited the temple Hozoin in the south of the capital. Here he had a contest with Oku Hozoin, the Nichiren sect pupil of the Zen priest Hoen Anai. The priest was a spearman, but no match for Musashi, who defeated him twice with his short wooden sword. Musashi stayed at the temple for some time, studying fighting techniques and enjoying talks with the priests. There is still today a traditional spear fighting form practiced by the monks of Hozoin. It is interesting that in ancient times the word Osho, which now means priest, used to mean spear teacher. Hoen Inai was pupil to Izumi Musashi no Kami, a master of Shinto Kendo. The priest used spears with cross-shaped blades kept outside the temple under the eaves and used in firefighting. When Musashi was in Iga province, he met a skilled chain and sickle fighter named Shishido Baikin. As Shishido twirled his chain, Musashi drew a dagger and pierced his breast, advancing to finish him off. The watching pupils attacked Musashi, but he frightened them away in 4 directions. In Edo, a fighter named Muso Gonosuke visited Musashi requesting a duel. Musashi was cutting wood to make a bow, and granting Gonosuke's request, stood up, intending to use the slender wand he was cutting as a sword. Gonosuke made a fierce attack, but Musashi stepped straight in and banged him on the head. Gonosuke went away. Passing through Izumo province, Musashi visited Lord Matsudaira and asked permission to fight with his strongest expert. There were many good strategists in Izumo. Permission was granted against a man who used an 8-foot-long hexagonal wooden pole. The contest was held in the Lord's library garden. Musashi used 2 wooden swords. He chased the samurai up the 2 wooden steps of the library veranda, thrust at his face on the second step, and hit him on both his arms as he flinched away. To the surprise of the assembled retainers, Lord Matsudaira asked Musashi to fight him. Musashi drove the Lord up the library steps as before, and when he tried to make a resolute fencing attitude, Musashi hit his sword with the fire and stones cut, breaking it in 2. The Lord bowed in defeat, and Musashi stayed for some time as his teacher. Musashi's most well-known duel was in the 17th year of Kaiucho, 1612, when he was in Ogura, in Bunzen province. His opponent was Sasaki Kojiro, a young man who had developed a strong fencing technique known as Tsubame Gaishi, or swallow counter, inspired by the motion of a swallow's tail in flight. Kojiro was retained by the lord of the province, Hosukawa Tadaoki. Musashi applied to Tadaoki for permission to fight Kojiro through the offices of one of the Hosokawa retainers who had been a pupil of Musashi's father, one Nagaoka Sato Okinaga. Permission was granted for the contest to be held at 8 o'clock the next morning, and the place was to be an island some few miles from Ogura. That night, Musashi left his lodging and moved to the house of Kobayashi Taro Zamon. This inspired a rumor that awe of Kojiro's subtle technique had made Musashi run away afraid for his life. The next day at 8 o'clock, Musashi could not be woken until a prompter came from the officials' assemblage on the island. He got up, drank the water they brought to him to wash with, and went straight down to the shore. As Sato rowed across to the island, Musashi fashioned a paper string to tie back the sleeves of his kimono and cut a wooden sword from a spare oar. When he had done this, he lay down to rest. The boat neared the place of combat, and Kojiro and the waiting officials were astounded to see the strange figure of Musashi with his unkempt hair tied up in a towel leap from the boat, brandishing the long wooden oar, and rush through the waves up to the beach towards his enemy. Kojiro drew his longsword, a fine blade by Nagamitsu of Baizen, and threw away his scabbard. "You have no more need of that," said Musashi as he rushed forward with his sword held to one side. Kojiro was provoked into making the first cut, and Musashi dashed upward at his blade, bringing the oar down on Kojiro's head. Kojiro was provoked into making the first cut, and Musashi dashed upward at his blade, bringing the oar down on Kojiro's head. As Kojiro fell, his sword, which had cut the towel from Musashi's head, cut across the hem of his divided skirt. Musashi noted Kojiro's condition and bowed to the astounded officials before running back to his boat. Some sources have it that after he killed Kojiro, Musashi threw down the oar and, nimbly leaping back several paces, drew both his swords and flourished them with a shout at his fallen enemy. It was about this time that Musashi stopped ever using real swords in duels. He was invincible, and from now on he devoted himself to the search for perfect understanding of the way of Kendo. In 1614 and 1615, he took the opportunity of once more experiencing warfare and siege. Ieyasu laid siege to Osaka Castle, where the supporters of the Ashikaga family were gathered in insurrection. Musashi joined the Tokugawa forces in both winter and summer campaigns, now fighting against those he had fought for as a youth at Sekigahara. According to his own writing, he came to understand strategy when he was 50 or 51 in 1634. He and his adopted son Lori, the waif whom he had met in Dewa province on his travels, settled in Ogura in this year. Musashi was never again to leave Kyushu Island. Kumamoto Castle. The Hosokawa house had been entrusted with the command of the hot seat of Higo province, Kumamoto Castle, and the new lord of Bonzen was an Ogasawara. Lori found employment under Ogasawara Tadazane, and as a captain in Tadazane's army, fought against the Christians in the Shimawara uprising of 1638, when Musashi was about 55. The lords of the southern provinces had always been antagonistic to the Tokugawas and were the instigators of intrigue with foreign powers and the Japanese Christians. Musashi was a member of the field staff at Shimawara, where the Christians were massacred. After this, Ieyasu closed the ports of Japan to foreign intercourse, and they remained closed for over 200 years. After 6 years in Ogura, Musashi was invited to stay with Churi, the Hosokawa lord of Kumamoto Castle, as a guest. He stayed a few years with Lord Churi and spent his time teaching and painting. In 1643, he retired to a life of seclusion in a cave called Ryugendo. Here he wrote Rin No Sho, addressed to his pupil Teruo Nobuyuki, a few weeks before his death on the 19th of May, 1645. Musashi is known to the Japanese as Kensei, that is, sword saint. Rin No Sho heads every Kendo bibliography, being unique among books of martial arts in that it deals with both the strategy of warfare and the methods of single combat in exactly the same way. The book is not a thesis on strategy. It is, in Musashi's words, a guide for men who want to learn strategy. And as a guide always leads, so the contents are always beyond the student's understanding. The more one reads the book, the more one finds in its pages. It is Musashi's last will, the key to the path he trod. When at 28 or 29, he had become such a strong fighter, he did not settle down and build a school replete with success, but became doubly engrossed with his study. In his last days even, he scorned the life of comfort with Lord Hosokawa and lived 2 years alone in a mountain cave deep in contemplation. The behavior of this cruel, headstrong man was evidently most humble and honest. Musashi wrote, "When you have attained the way of strategy, there will not be one thing you cannot understand, and you will see the way in everything." He did, in fact, become a master of arts and crafts. He produced masterpieces of ink painting, probably more highly valued by the Japanese than ink paintings of any other. His works included cormorants, herons, Hotie, the Shinto god, dragons, birds with flowers, birds dead in a tree, Daruma, Bodhidharma, and others. He was a fine calligrapher, evidenced by his piece Senki, War Spirit. There's a small wood sculpture of the Buddhist deity Fudo Myo in private hands. A sculptor of Kwannon was lost recently. He made works of metal and founded the school of sword guardsmaid who signed Niten after him. He is said to have written poems and songs, but none of these survive. It is said that also he was commissioned by the shogun Iemitsu to paint the sunrise over Edo Castle. His paintings are sometimes impressed with his seal, Musashi, or his nom de plume, Niten. Niten means two heavens, said by some to allude to his fighting attitude with a sword in each hand held above his head. In some places, he established schools known as Niten Ryu, and in other places called Enmi Ryu, clear circle. He wrote, "Study the ways of all professions." It is evident that he did just that. He sought out not only great swordsmen, but also priests, strategists, artists, and craftsmen, eager to broaden his knowledge. Musashi writes about the various aspects of Kendo in such a way that it is possible for beginners to study at beginner's level and for Kendo masters to study the same words on a higher level. This applies not just to military strategy, but to any situation where plans and tactics are used. Japanese businessmen have used Rin No Sho as a guide for business practice, making sales campaigns like military operations, using the same energetic methods. In the same way that Musashi seems to have been a horribly cruel man, yet was following logically an honest ideal, so successful business seems to most people to be without conscience. Musashi's life study is thus as relevant in the 20th century as it was on the medieval battleground, and applies not just to the Japanese race, but to all nations. I suppose you could sum up his inspiration as humility and hard work. Introduction from Miyamoto Musashi. I've been many years training in the way of strategy called Niten Ichi Ryu, and now I think I will explain it in writing for the first time. It is now during the first 10 days of the 10th month in the 20th year of Kanai, 1645. I have climbed Mountain Iwatu of Higo Kyushu to pay homage to heaven, pray to Kwannon, and kneel before Buddha. I am a warrior of Hirima Province, Shinmin Musashi no Kami Fujiwara no Geshin, age 60 years. From my youth, my heart has been inclined toward the way of strategy. My first duel was when I was 13. I struck down a strategist of the Shinto school, one Arima Kihii. When I was 16, I struck down an able strategist, Tadashima Akiyama. When I was 21, I went up to the capital and met all manner of strategists, never once failing to win in many contests. After that, I went from province to province, dueling with strategists of various schools, and not once failed to win, even though I had as many as 60 encounters. This was between the ages of 13 and 28 or 29. When I reached 30, I looked back on my past. The previous victories were not due to my having mastered strategy. Perhaps it was natural ability or even the order of heaven, or that other schools' strategy was inferior. After that, I studied morning and evening, searching for the principle, and came to realize the way of strategy when I was 50. Since then, I have lived without any particular way. Thus, with the virtue of strategy, I practice many arts and abilities. All things with no teacher. To write this book, I did not use the law of Buddha or the teachings of Confucius, neither old war chronicles nor books on martial tactics. I take up my brush to explain the true spirit of this Ichi school as it is mirrored in the way of heaven and Kwanan. The time is the night of the 10th day of the 10th month at the hour of the tiger, 3 to 5 a.m.